The church bell had rung 13 times that Sunday morning in August of 1877, though everyone knew it should have stopped at 12. In Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania, a town carved from coal dust and mountain stone, people noticed things like that. They noticed, and they remembered, and they whispered about it long after the sound faded into the heavy summer air. Sarah Bennett sat in the back pew with her twin daughters pressed close against her sides. Mary on the left, Martha on the right, their small hands folded together in their lap like white birds at rest. The girls were 7 years old, born on the same winter night that took their father down into the mines forever. They had his dark hair and their mother's pale eyes, but there was something else in those eyes, too. Something that made the other children step back when they walked by. Something that made grown men cross themselves when the twins looked their way. The wooden church felt smaller that morning, as if the walls had moved closer in the night. Sunlight fell through the stained glass windows in red and blue patches, painting the congregation in colors that looked too much like bruises. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear and the wild roses that grew over the cemetery fence. Reverend Cain stood at the pulpit like a black scarecrow against the morning light. He was a tall man with hollow cheeks and hands that shook when he held his Bible. He had come to Cedar Hollow 3 months ago, after the old Reverend died in his sleep with a smile on his face that no one could explain. The new Reverend did not smile. He spoke of sin and judgment and the wrath of God that waited in the shadows for those who strayed from the narrow path. "My brothers and sisters," Reverend Cain began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through cloth. "We gather today in the house of the Lord, but I fear evil has found its way among us." Sarah felt Mary's hand tighten in hers. Martha shifted closer, her breath warm against her mother's arm. The twins did not speak much, but they listened to everything. They heard the words that grown-ups thought they were too young to understand. They felt the fear that crept through the town like fog from the river. "There are those among us," the Reverend continued, his gray eyes scanning the congregation, "who walk in darkness while claiming to serve the light. There are children who know things no child should know, who speak without words and see without looking." Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, turned in her seat to stare at Sarah and the twins. Her husband followed her gaze, then looked quickly away. All around the church, heads began to turn. Faces that had once been kind now wore masks of suspicion and fear. "I have seen them," Reverend Cain said, his voice rising like smoke from a fire. "These unnatural children who hold hands and share thoughts like demons share whispers, who know when the storms are coming before the clouds gather, who speak of the dead as if they were sitting at the breakfast table." Sarah's cheeks burned with shame and anger. It was true that the twins were different. They had always been different. When one cried, the other felt the tears. When one was hungry, the other's stomach would growl. They knew when their mother was sad before she showed it on her face. They knew when Mrs. Patterson's cat was lost 3 days before anyone else noticed it was gone. But they were not demons. They were her children. They were 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms and loved apple pie and fed stray dogs with scraps from their dinner plates. They were not cursed. They were just different, the way some people were born with green eyes or red hair or voices that could carry a tune. "The Lord tells us," Reverend Cain continued, his finger pointing straight at the back pew where Sarah sat with her daughters, "that we must not suffer a witch to live, that we must cast out the unclean thing before it spreads its poison through the flock." The word which fell into the church like a stone into still water. The silence that followed was deeper than any quiet Sarah had ever heard. She could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes pressing down on her family. She could taste the fear in the air, bitter as medicine. Mary and Martha did not move. They sat perfectly still, their hands still folded together, their pale eyes fixed on the Reverend as if they were memorizing his face. Sarah wanted to stand up and take them away from this place, away from these people who had been their neighbors and friends just yesterday. But her legs felt like they were made of stone. "I have prayed on this matter," Reverend Cain said, his voice softer now, but no less frightening. "I have asked the Lord for guidance, and he has shown me the truth. These children are marked by Satan himself. They are a test of our faith, a challenge to our righteousness. Old Mr. Bailey, who had given Mary and Martha peppermint sticks every time they came to his farm, would not meet Sarah's eyes. Mrs. Cooper, who had brought soup when Sarah was sick with fever last winter, stared at her lap as if she had never seen her own hands before. Even young Tom Miller, who had courted Sarah before she married John Bennett, turned his face away when she looked his way. "We must not let pity stay our hands," the Reverend warned. "We must not let the faces of children blind us to the evil that dwells within. The devil is cunning, my friends. He knows how to make his servants look innocent and sweet." Sarah felt something break inside her chest, something that had been holding her heart together since John died in a mine collapse. The people of Cedar Hollow had helped her through that dark time. They had brought food and comfort and promises that she would never be alone. But now they sat in their wooden pews and listened to a stranger call her children demons, and they said nothing to defend the little girls they had watched grow from babies. "I call upon you," Reverend Cain said, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, "to shun these creatures of darkness. Do not speak to them. Do not trade with their mother. Do not let your children play with them, lest they be corrupted by their unnatural ways." The twins' hands squeezed tighter together. Sarah saw Martha's lower lip tremble, but neither girl made sound. They had learned early in life that being quiet was safer than being heard. They had learned that being different meant being careful. As the Reverend continued his sermon about sin and judgment and the fires that waited for the wicked, Sarah made a decision that would change everything that came after. She would not sit here and let this man poison her neighbors against her children. She would not let fear turn love into hatred. She stood up slowly, her legs still shaking, but her back straight. Mary and Martha rose with her, their small hands never letting go of each other. The whole congregation turned to watch as Sarah walked down the center aisle toward the door, her daughters beside her like shadows in the colored light. "You will see," Reverend Cain called after them, his voice following them out into the summer morning. "You will all see what happens when evil is allowed to flourish. The Lord's judgment is coming to Cedar Hollow, and it will not be turned aside by sentiment or foolish mercy." Outside the church, the air felt cleaner, but no less heavy. Sarah looked back once at the building where she had been married, where she had prayed for her husband's safe return from the mines, where she had brought her newborn daughters to be blessed by a kinder man than the one who stood there now. The bell tower cast a long shadow across the cemetery, and Sarah wondered if shadows could grow so long that they swallowed everything in their path. 3 days after Reverend Cain's sermon, the Bennett house stood like an island in a sea of silence. No one came to the door anymore. No children played in the yard. Even the birds seemed to avoid the oak tree where Mary and Martha's rope swing hung motionless in the August heat. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, counting the coins in John's old tobacco tin for the 4th time that morning. $17.36. Everything she had left in the world, besides the house and the acre of land it sat on. The mine company had given her $40 when John died, but that money had stretched thin over the past year and a half. Now it was almost gone, and no one in Cedar Hollow would sell her food or supplies. The twins sat on the floor by the window, playing with their corn husk dolls in the patch of sunlight that fell across the wooden boards. They whispered to each other in the way they always had, words so soft that Sarah could never quite hear them. But she knew they understood what was happening. Children always knew more than grown-ups wanted to believe. Mary looked up from her doll, her pale eyes finding her mother's face. "Mama," she said in her small, clear voice, "are we going away?" Sarah's hands stilled on the coins. She had not spoken of leaving out loud, but the thought had been growing in her mind like a seed in dark soil. There were other towns beyond the mountains, places where no one knew about Reverend Cain's words or the fear that had settled over Cedar Hollow like dust after a cave-in. "Maybe, sweet girl," Sarah said softly. "Would that frighten you?" Martha shook her head without looking up from her doll. "We're not frightened," she said. "But the people here are." The simple truth of it made Sarah's chest tight. Her 7-year-old daughters understood what grown men and women could not. Fear was a choice, not a curse. But knowing that did not make it easier to live with. A knock at the door made all three of them freeze. Sarah had not heard footsteps on the porch, but then again, she had been listening to footsteps for days now. They came at night mostly, slow and careful, circling the house like wolves around a fire. Sometimes she saw shadows moving past the windows. Sometimes she heard voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. The knock came again, harder this time. Sarah rose from her chair and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the floor. She did not open it. "Who's there?" she called through the wood. "Tom Miller," came the answer. "Sarah, I need to speak with you." Tom had been John's friend before he became Sarah's suitor. After John died, Tom had come calling with flowers and promises and talk of marriage. But Sarah had not been ready to replace her husband, and Tom had eventually stopped coming around. She had not seen him since the day in church 3 days ago, when he turned his face away from her like all the rest. Sarah opened the door just wide enough to see his face. Tom stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and worry lines creased deep around his eyes. He was a good man, Sarah knew, a kind man who had never raised his voice or his hand to anyone. But even good men could be afraid. "What do you want, Tom?" she asked. "To help you," he said quietly. "To warn you." Sarah stepped outside and closed the door behind her, not wanting the twins to hear whatever Tom had come to say. The evening air was cooler than the house, but it carried the smell of smoke from the coal fires that burned day and night in the town below. "There's talk, Sarah," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bad talk." "I know about the talk," Sarah replied. "I heard it in church." Tom shook his head. "This is different. This is about what they're planning to do." The words hit Sarah like cold water. She had known that things were bad, but she had not imagined they might get worse. She had thought that if she kept quiet and stayed away from town, the fear would pass like a fever breaking. "What kind of plans?" she asked. Tom looked around as if he expected to see watchers in the trees. "Some of the men met at Bailey's farm last night. They're saying the twins need to be dealt with before something terrible happens to the town." "What terrible thing?" Sarah's voice was sharp now. "What have my children done except exist?" "It's not what they've done," Tom said. "It's what people think they might do. The Reverend has them convinced that the twins are some kind of evil, that they'll bring a curse down on all of us if they're not stopped." Sarah felt the world tilt under her feet. These were men she had known all her life. Men who had helped John build this house, who had eaten at her table, who had tipped their hats to her on Sunday mornings. Now, they were planning to harm her children because a stranger in a black coat had told them to be afraid. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow night," Tom said. "They're coming here tomorrow night." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun. Sarah closed her eyes and saw her daughters' faces, innocent and trusting and beautiful. She saw their small hands folded together, their pale eyes full of love and questions and the kind of wisdom that frightened people who had forgotten how to wonder the world. "Come away with me," Tom said suddenly. "You and the girls. We can leave tonight. I have a wagon and horses. We could be in the next county before anyone knows we're gone." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him. Tom Miller, who had loved her once and maybe loved her still. Tom Miller, who was offering to give up his farm and his life in Cedar Hollow to save a woman and her strange children. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his hat turning in his hands like a prayer wheel. "Because I knew John," he said finally. "Because I know you. And because those little girls and their never hurt anyone in their lives." Through the window, Sarah could see Mary and Martha still playing with their dolls in the last light of day. They looked so small sitting there, so fragile and precious. The thought of anyone hurting them made her stomach twist with a fury she had never felt before. But leaving meant running. It meant abandoning the only home her daughters had ever known, the house John had built with his own hands, the grave where he rested under the old pine tree behind the church. It meant starting over with nothing in a world that might be just as cruel as the one they were leaving behind. "I need to think," Sarah said. Tom nodded. "Don't think too long," he warned. "They're not planning to give you much choice in the matter." After Tom left, Sarah went back inside and found the twins exactly where she had left them. But now they were looking at her with those pale eyes that saw too much, and she knew they had heard every word through the thin walls. "Mama," Mary said softly, "we don't want anyone to be hurt because of us." "No one's going to be hurt," Sarah said, though she was not sure she believed it. Martha set down her doll and stood up. She walked to her mother and took her hand in both of her small ones. "We know what you have to choose," she said, "and we know it's hard." The simple understanding in her daughter's voice broke something inside Sarah's chest. These children, these beautiful, strange, wonderful children, were comforting her. They were 7 years old and facing the hatred of an entire town, and they were trying to make their mother feel better. That night, Sarah sat by the window and watched the shadows move in the yard while her daughters slept. She counted the coins in the tobacco tin again. She thought about Tom's offer and the wagon waiting in his barn. She thought about the men who were planning to come for her children and the fear that had turned neighbors into enemies. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, footsteps circled the house like a promise and a threat, and Sarah knew that by tomorrow's end, nothing would ever be the same again. The flame started at midnight on August 15th, 1877, in the exact spot where Reverend Cain had built his bonfire of books he called unholy. Sarah woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Mary crying in the next room. Not the soft whimper of a bad dream, but the deep, broken sobs of a child who had seen something no child should see. Sarah ran to the twins' bedroom and found them both standing at the window, their white nightgowns glowing like ghosts in the orange light that painted the walls. Below them, Cedar Hollow was burning. The fire moved like a living thing, creeping from house to house with hungry fingers of light. It licked at the wooden walls of the general store, wrapped around the church steeple like a rope, and danced across the rooftops like it was celebrating something terrible and final. "Mama," Martha whispered without turning from the window, "they did this because of us." Sarah pulled both girls against her, feeling their small bodies shake with fear and understanding. Through the glass, she could see people running in the streets below. Some carried buckets of water that seemed useless against the wall of flame. Others just ran, their faces lit by the fire, their mouths open in screams that the wind carried away. "No," Sarah said firmly, though her voice trembled. "People did this. People chose this. Not you." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt the weight of truth settling in her chest like a stone. The men who had met at Bailey's farm had not come for her children, as Tom had warned. Instead, they had chosen a different kind of judgment. They had decided to cleanse Cedar Hollow with fire, to burn away what they saw as corruption before it could spread. The flames reached the Miller farm first. Sarah watched Tom's barn collapse in a shower of sparks that rose into the night sky like fallen stars. She thought of his offer to take them away, of the wagon that now fed the hungry fire, of the choice she had been too afraid to make in time. "We have to go," Sarah said, pulling the twins away from the window. "We have to leave now." She grabbed the satchel she had packed after Tom's visit, the one with their few good clothes and John's Bible and the $17 from the tobacco tin. Mary and Martha followed her without question, their bare feet silent on the wooden floors. They moved through the house like shadows, gathering nothing but each other. Outside, the world had turned into something from a nightmare. The air was thick with smoke that burned Sarah's lungs and made her eyes water. Ash fell from the sky like gray snow, covering everything in a blanket of sorrow. The heat pressed against them like a giant hand, pushing them back toward the house even as the flames crept closer. Sarah looked toward the road that led out of town, but it was blocked by a wall of fire that stretched from the creek to the pine woods. The flames had surrounded them while they slept, cutting off every path of escape. Cedar Hollow had become a cage of fire, and they were trapped inside with the fear and hatred that had built it. "This way," Mary said suddenly, taking her mother's hand and pulling her toward the old mine shaft behind the house. It was the same shaft where John had worked, where he had died when the roof came down like the judgment of an angry God. Sarah had never been down there, had never wanted to see the place that took her husband away. But now the twins led her to the wooden frame that marked the entrance, and Sarah saw that the shaft went deeper than she had imagined. The darkness below was cooler than the burning air above, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the depths. "The tunnel goes under the mountain," Martha explained, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Papa showed us before he died. It comes out by the river, past the fire." Sarah stared at her daughters in wonder and terror. John had been dead for over a year. The twins had been barely 6 when he died. How could they know about tunnels and rivers and ways through the darkness that she had never heard of? But there was no time for questions. The fire had reached the oak tree in their yard, and the rope swing was burning like a torch against the night. Sarah could hear voices shouting in the distance, could see figures moving through the smoke like demons in the orange light. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. The twins nodded together, their pale eyes reflecting the flames that danced all around them. "Papa told us," Mary said simply, "in case we ever needed to find our way home." They climbed down into the mine shaft, Sarah first, then the twins. The ladder was old and rough, but it held their weight. As they descended into the earth, the sound of the fire faded to a distant roar, like thunder rolling across the mountains. The air grew cooler and cleaner, though it carried the smell of deep places and old stone. At the bottom of the shaft, Sarah lit the candle she had grabbed from the kitchen table. The flame cast dancing shadows on the tunnel walls, and she could see that the passage stretched away into darkness in both directions. Water dripped from the ceiling, and their footsteps echoed like whispers in the narrow space. "This way," Martha said, pointing toward the left tunnel. "Follow the water sound." They walked through the darkness for what felt like hours, Sarah holding the candle high and the twins walking hand in hand behind her. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing Sarah to duck her head in places. But it was steady and straight, carved by men who knew their trade and built things to last. As they walked, Sarah thought about the town burning above them. She thought about the people she had known all her life, running through the streets with terror in their eyes. She thought about Reverend Cain and his words about evil and judgment and the price of righteousness. She wondered if he was running too, or if he stood in the flames and called it God's will. The twins did not speak as they walked, but Sarah could feel their presence like warmth at her back. They were so small and brave, leading their mother through the darkness toward a hope they had learned from their dead father's voice. Sarah did not understand how they could know things they had never been taught, how they could hear voices from beyond the grave. But she was learning that understanding was less important than trust. The sound of water grew louder as they walked, and finally Sarah saw light ahead. Not the orange light of fire, but the silver light of stars reflected on moving water. The tunnel opened onto a rocky bank beside a creek that ran clear and cold through the pine woods. Above them, the sky was black except for the glow on the horizon where Cedar Hollow burned. Sarah helped the twins climb out of the tunnel, and they sat together on the rocks beside the water. The creek whispered over the stones, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called through the darkness. It was peaceful here, far from the flames and the fear and the voices that had called her children demons. "Where will we go now, Mama?" Mary asked, her small hand finding Sarah's in the darkness. Sarah looked back toward the glow on the horizon, toward the town where she had been born and married and hoped to grow old. She thought of Tom Miller and his kindness, of Mrs. Henderson and her general store, of all the people who had let fear turn them into something they never meant to become. "Away," Sarah said softly. "Far away from here." The twins nodded as if they had expected this answer. They sat quietly beside the creek, watching the water carry away pieces of ash that had fallen from the burning sky, and Sarah wondered if some fires burned so hot that they changed everything they touched, even the things they never meant to harm. 37 years after the fire that took Cedar Hollow, a traveling photographer named William Hayes came looking for the ghost town he had heard whispered about in the taverns of nearby settlements. It was October of 1914, and the leaves on the mountain maples had turned the color of old blood. Hayes carried a heavy camera and glass plates wrapped in black cloth, hoping to capture images of America's forgotten places before they disappeared completely into memory. He found Cedar Hollow on a gray morning when the mist hung low in the valley like the breath of sleeping giants. Where a town had once stood, only stone foundations remained, scattered across the hillside like broken teeth. Wild roses had grown over most of the ruins, their thorns thick as a man's thumb, their blooms the pale pink of old scars. The church bell tower still stood, blackened by fire but refusing to fall, its bell long since melted and carried away by scavengers. Hayes set up his camera beside what had been the main road and took pictures of the emptiness. Through his lens, he could see the shadows of buildings that no longer existed, the ghost shapes of lives that had been lived and lost in this place. The county records in the nearest town listed Cedar Hollow as destroyed by a mining accident in August of 1877. Gas explosion, they said. Tragic but not uncommon in those days when men dug deep into the earth for coal and sometimes found death instead. But the old folks in the surrounding settlements told different stories when they had enough whiskey in them to loosen their tongues. They spoke of a preacher who came to town speaking of demons and judgment. They whispered about twin girls who knew things no children should know and a fire that burned too hot and too fast to be natural. They said the flames had moved like they were alive, choosing which buildings to take and which to leave standing. Hayes had heard these stories and dismissed them as the kind of folklore that grew around any tragedy like moss on a gravestone. But as he walked through the ruins, taking photographs and making notes, he began to feel that something more than a mining accident had happened here. The burned foundations were arranged in a perfect circle around the remains of the church, as if the fire had started at the center and spread outward like ripples in a pond. And in the very heart of the devastation, where logic said the flames should have burned hottest, a single house foundation remained almost untouched by the fire. Hayes consulted his map and his notes from the county clerk's office. This had been the Bennett property, home to Sarah Bennett, widow of miner John Bennett, and her twin daughters Mary and Martha. According to the official records, all three had died in the fire along with the rest of the town's 47 residents. But Hayes noticed something strange about the Bennett Foundation. Unlike the others, it had a basement that had been dug deeper than seemed necessary for a simple farmhouse. Curiosity overcame caution, and Hayes climbed down into the basement using a rope he had brought for his photography equipment. The stone walls were blackened with soot, but they had held firm against the fire that destroyed everything above. In the far corner, beneath a pile of fallen timbers, Hayes found something that made him question everything he thought he knew about Cedar Hollow's end. 2 small graves had been carved into the stone floor of the basement. They were barely large enough for children, marked with simple wooden crosses that bore the names Mary Bennett and Martha Bennett carved in careful letters. The dates below the names showed they had died on August 15th, 1877, the same night as the fire. But these graves had been dug from inside the basement, not from above. Someone had buried these children after the fire, someone who had survived long enough to tend to the dead. Hayes knelt beside the graves and brushed away the dust and debris that had accumulated over the decades. As he did, his fingers found something else hidden in a crack between the stones. A small wooden box, no bigger than his fist, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. Inside the box, Hayes found a letter written in a woman's careful handwriting, along with 2 small locks of dark hair tied with faded blue ribbon. The letter was addressed to anyone who finds this, and dated simply August 1877. The letter told a story that would never appear in any county record or newspaper account. Sarah Bennett had written it by candlelight in the basement of her burning house, her twin daughters lying unconscious in her arms after breathing too much smoke during their escape through the mine tunnels. She had brought them back to their home, the only safe place she could think of, but the smoke had already done its work on their small lungs. They were not demons, Sarah had written in her shaking hand. They were beautiful children who saw the world differently than most. They knew things because they listened to voices that others could not hear. They loved with hearts too big for this small town to understand. If love is evil, then let me be evil too. The letter went on to describe the 3 days Sarah had spent alone in the basement, tending to her dying daughters and digging their graves in the stone floor with tools she found in John's old workshop. She had buried them with their corn husk dolls and the little wooden horse their father had carved for their 6th birthday. She had sung them lullabies as she covered them with stones, the same song she had sung when they were babies afraid of thunderstorms. On the 4th day, Sarah had written, she planned to walk back through the mine tunnel to the creek where they had found safety. She would follow the water downstream until it carried her to whatever came after Cedar Hollow. She did not want to live in a world that would burn children for being different, but she could not bear to leave her daughters alone in the dark. I do not know if anyone will ever find this letter, Sarah had concluded. I do not know if anyone will ever know the truth about what happened here. But I want someone to remember that Mary and Martha Bennett were real. They were 7 years old, and they loved apple pie and feeding stray cats and watching clouds make shapes in the sky. They held hands when they were scared and shared their thoughts like other children share toys. They were mine, and I was theirs, and that was the only magic we ever needed. Hayes read the letter 3 times before he carefully folded it and put it back in the wooden box. He sat in the basement for a long time, listening to the wind move through the ruins above and thinking about the story that history had chosen to forget. When he finally climbed out of the basement, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of old roses. That night, Hayes camped beside the ruins and developed his photographs by the light of his campfire. As the images appeared on the glass plates, he saw something that his naked eye had missed. In every photograph of the Bennett Foundation, there were shadows that looked almost like people. 2 small figures standing hand in hand beside the basement stairs, and a taller figure kneeling beside them with arms that seemed to reach out in an embrace. Hayes knew it was probably just tricks of light and shadow, the way the mind saw faces in clouds and heard voices in the wind. But as he packed his equipment the next morning, preparing to leave Cedar Hollow behind, he made a decision that would change how the story was remembered. He would not publish the photographs or the story of what he had found in the basement. Instead, he would carry the wooden box and its contents to the nearest town and leave them with the pastor of the Methodist Church. He would ask the pastor to remember Sarah Bennett and her twin daughters, not as demons or witches or victims of a mining accident, but as people who had loved each other in a world that punished love for taking unfamiliar forms. Years later, when Hayes was an old man dying in a hospital bed in Philadelphia, he would still dream about Cedar Hollow. In his dreams, he would see the 3 figures from his photographs walking together down a road that led away from the burned foundations, their hands joined and their faces turned toward a horizon that promised kinder places than the one they had left behind. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was right, travelers passing through the valley where Cedar Hollow once stood would hear something that sounded almost like children's laughter echoing off the mountains, as if somewhere in the darkness, love had found a way to outlast the fear that tried to destroy it.